Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. Now, I suppose you clicked on this video because you are considering to take English literature as your minor. I think there are a lot of videos out there about people who have English literature as their major, but personally I have not seen that many about people having it as their minor, so I thought I would introduce you to what I personally had to read whilst taking English literature as a minor. Now, to be fully transparent, English literature isn't even fully my minor. Like, the name of the minor that I take is language/culture/literature. But because I already studied cultural studies in my major, I focus on languages and literature in my minor. As to languages, I take Korean and Spanish classes. And with like the literature part of my minor, I could have focused on anything I wanted to. I could have focused on Russian literature, Italian literature, Polish literature. It doesn't even matter, there were so many options, and I could have also mixed and matched all of those different world literatures, but personally I decided to focus on both British and American literature because that's like where my main interest lies, I suppose. The beauty in taking something as a minor is that you basically have free reign of constructing your personal course schedule according to what you are interested in. You know, with majors, they often make you take entire modules and courses because you have to take them. If you take something as a major, there are often courses, even if you're not specifically interested in, that you have no way of getting around because they are like an obligatory part of finishing that major. But if you take something as a minor, you often have way more freedom as to choosing what things you are specifically interested in. Now, for me, I only had like 4 obligatory lectures that I had to take. They were all like kind of like introductory lectures to specific themes. I like wrote down everything I have to tell you about, so don't mind me checking my list every once in a while. So those obligatory lectures were about linguistics, literature studies, media studies, and old languages and cultures. I had to take them during like my first 2 semesters where I was already taking my language courses, and afterwards I could really freely pick all the literature classes I was interested in. While I was gathering all this information, I noticed that I basically had 2 different kinds of classes. I had ones in which we read excerpts of a plethora of works and authors, and others where we only read like a handful of works, but those we read from start to finish basically. So in here you will find everything. Okay, so let's get started. This is not necessarily chronological. It's not like in the order I took these classes in, but it doesn't even matter. So I took a lecture on early modern literature. And here that was one of the classes where we read excerpts out of a lot of different works. There are too many to like list them all specifically. So I'm just gonna be name dropping a couple of authors and their works. So we read stuff by Thomas Wyatt. We read the parts of Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, of Sir Philip Sidney's Astrophel and Stella. We read a bunch of Shakespeare's sonnets and parts of The Tempest. We read works of John Donne, Ben Jonson, John Milton, and also William Baldwin and Thomas Nash. Another class I took was like the opposite module of that, where we only focus on a few specific works, but those we mostly read from start to finish. There was a class that was called Crime and the City, LA in the Crime Novel. And if you know my channel, you know that I'm 100% into like detective fiction, especially like older British detective fiction, and this was about modern American, so it's like not the same, but still, hey, like a class about detective fiction, I was so down for that. And in this class, we focused mainly on these 2 books, Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep and Walter Mosley's Devil in the Blue Dress. By the way, I love this cover. I think it looks really cool. Those were the 2 novels we fully read in that class. And then we also read a couple of excerpts from Elroy's White Jazz, LA Confidential, and The Black Dahlia, as well as from Michael Connelly, Angel's Flight, and The Burning Room. Furthermore, I took an entire lecture in Shakespeare and we read a bunch of plays for that class. Like, first we read a couple of sonnets, luckily not all of them because they're like 144. Like, we only focused on a few of them, and then we continued to Shakespeare's plays. We read, it was Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, Hamlet, Richard III, As You Like It, and A Midsummer Night's Dream. I read them all in this big complete works of Shakespeare. It's like, I don't know, I think my mother's book, and yeah, I made good use of it during that semester. Then moving on to a bit of American literature, I took an introduction to the study of American literature and media. And here basically we focus on a different like decade era, basically every other week. So we read a bunch of excerpts out of everything that American literature has to offer. Okay, so we started off with Anne Bradstreet's poetry and works by Winthrop. We read Edgar Allan Poe, The Telltale Heart, and a few other of his short stories, as well as works of Franklin and Crèvecoeur. We read Emily Dickinson, George Horton, Henry David Thoreau. For Henry David Thoreau, we only started reading his work Walden, but I actually liked it so much that I ended up picking up the entire book privately and started reading it. I never finished it, but I continued reading past what we had discussed in class, and I actually really liked it. We read Kate Chopin's Desiree's Baby. We read works by T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, William Cullen Williams. We even looked into F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. We read parts of Sarah Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, parts of Arthur Miller and Lorraine Hansberry, as well as Webb Du Bois and Booker Washington. So like this class, I think out of all of them covered the most authors and works, but it was also like really fascinating. The next class I took was actually quite specific again, because it was about Venice and world literature, but in like English speaking world literature. And we actually did not only talk about books in this class, but also about paintings. There was also like a fun little tidbit. So here we covered Ben Jonson's Volpone, Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice and Othello, of course, Byron's Childe Harold's Pilgrimage and Beppo and The Ode to Venice. Byron played a really big part in that, so like lecture or course. We covered part of Thomas Mann's Tod in Venedig, as well as James Cooper's The Bravo. We read parts of Daphne du Maurier's Don't Look Now. Daphne du Maurier, you will probably know her from being the author of Rebecca, but we did not read Rebecca in this class. Then we also read a ton of Shelley and Wordsworth and Ruskin, and we also covered Henry James and Donna Leon, when we in the end talked about like Venice as the scene of a crime, and Donna Leon being like this famous author of like, again, detective crime fiction taking place in Venice. I especially enjoyed those parts of the lecture. It's just my favorite genre. It really is. Okay, moving on. I have taken over the years 2 classes on the Victorian novel. Actually, like one of them I'm still taking at this moment, but one I already finished. There was just like a lecture called The Victorian Novel, and works that we covered were Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, Dracula, which I'm actually reading right now. Like, for example, with that class, it wasn't a requirement that you had read all of those novels, and it wasn't even like necessarily part of the course that you were reading them as you had the lecture, because it was a lecture where like the professor, like they spoke to us all the time, and you as a student, you didn't have to like interact or do anything basically, and like in the end you had to hand in a portfolio. But we talked about these novels, and of course it was better if you at least knew what they were about. It was even better if you had read them. And like, for example, during the course I did not have time to read Dracula, but I am working on it right now. I have just about started, and I'm really liking it so far. Anyway, but yeah, we talked about Great Expectations, Dracula, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and then more like in general, instead of focusing on specific works. We talked about the Bronte sisters, of course. You can't leave them out when talking about the Victorian novel, as well as George Eliot. The Victorian novel class I'm taking right now is more so focused on the coming of age novel, or the Bildungsroman. And this course again is about 5 specific books, but these we are supposed to read from start to finish. And we also started off in that lecture with Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, so it really came in handy that I had taken that other class before, so I already knew it, hehe. Afterwards, we read Jane Eyre. I don't have a physical copy because I listened to it on YouTube, actually. Now, after the Christmas holidays, we're gonna read The Picture of Dorian Gray. Right now, we're talking about Jude the Obscure, and then we're gonna finish the class with Jacob's Room. Last but not least, I took a lecture on literature in Britain and Ireland between the 1660s and 1830s. And here again, we covered a lot of authors, a lot of works, instead of focusing on specific books that we read from start to finish. Some of the authors we discussed were Keats, Shelley, Byron, Wordsworth, and Coleridge, Alexander Pope and Blake, Thomas Gray, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, as well as Virginia Woolf, Jane Austen, like we talked about Emma, for example, and Northanger Abbey. And then we also talked about Anne Radcliffe and Walter Scott. Like, these are just a couple of authors and a couple of the novels and excerpts we read in all these classes, especially with the ones where we covered so many different authors. It was kind of hard to like gather all the little excerpts we read during class. I couldn't even tell you which format I prefer, because of course it's nice to get like a broader view over like a lot of authors, a lot of genres, a lot of works out there. But then during the classes where you focus on like just a few novels, of course you kind of take more away maybe. So these things right here are just a few of the things that I had to read as an English literature minor. Now personally, I love having English literature as my minor because I love this aspect that I can pick and choose the classes I'm actually interested in. As you can tell by the classes I took, I'm really interested in like the Victorian novels as well as Shakespeare, as well as crime fiction in general, so that I could like pick and choose classes around those themes. I really like that. I hope this kind of helped you out maybe. Of course, like because in the minor you can so individually choose your classes very often, this is like completely personal. Like the classes that I took, the books I had to read, this cannot really speak to anything that you might encounter in your possible future when you take English literature as a minor. But nonetheless, I hope that maybe this helps you out in some aspect. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'm gonna see you in the next one. Bye!